Sometimes it's not the shouting that hurts, it's the smiling. The way someone can cut you open with charm and leave no visible scar. Grayson had a line he loved to toss around at dinners. Like a party trick. "One of these days, I'll just walk out," he'd say with a grin, "and no one will see me again." And every single time they laughed. Naomi. Beth. Even me once. Back when I thought the joke meant nothing. But jokes, you see, they carry weight. Especially when they land on you every single night. It was late October in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The leaves had turned, the porch smelled of wet pumpkins, and our kitchen was dressed like a Pinterest dream. Cinnamon simmered on the stove. A roast rested on a ceramic platter. I'd folded the napkins into tiny foxes. Beth arrived first, cheeks pink from the cold. She hugged me longer than usual. "Smells amazing in here," she said. I smiled. Just keeping up appearances. She didn't laugh. Just tilted her head. I changed the subject. Naomi came bearing a bottle of wine and a look that said she needed this evening to go well. We hugged, then turned to setting the table. And, just like clockwork, Grayson strolled in late, still in his work blazer, holding a freshly opened bottle of red like he was the headliner. Dinner flowed smoothly. At least on the surface. Then came dessert. Beth had just passed the whipped cream. Naomi was asking about my birthday plans. And Grayson, with perfect timing, lifted his glass and said it. "One of these days, I'll just walk out. Margot won't even notice until the coffee's cold." Laughter. A ripple, awkward but automatic. Except Naomi. She didn't laugh. Her eyes landed on me and stayed. I held the carving knife loosely in my hand, still warm from the roast. My fingers curled slightly tighter. Beth, ever the peacekeeper, jumped in. "Anyway, I was thinking we could do brunch next Sunday. That new place, Lavender and Rye." I nodded. Didn't really hear her. That night, after the dishes were stacked and the leftover pie covered in foil, I found myself in the bathroom staring into the mirror. Not looking for bruises. There weren't any, never had been. Just a woman I barely recognized. Hair tied back. Sweater stretched. Smile gone. I opened the cabinet under the sink, found the old notebook I used to keep recipes in. I flipped to a clean page. And wrote one sentence. "He doesn't hit, he erases." Later we lay in bed. The house was still. The only sound was the low hum of the heat vent kicking on. Grayson turned his back to me, murmured almost to himself. "You're lucky I'm still here." I didn't answer, didn't flinch, just reached over and turned off the lamp. The notebook was next to my pillow. Still open. And the pen, I hadn't capped it. He laughed as he signed it. I didn't. That's the thing about Grayson, he always laughed first, so no one would ask if he was serious. So no one would look too long or read between the lines. But I'd started reading. Every look, every pause, every deflection masked as charm. It was Thanksgiving. The house was warm, a little too warm. Candied yams on the counter. A pot of cranberry chutney bubbling low. The table set with flickering tea lights and folded brown napkins. Beth was humming to herself, mashing potatoes. Naomi leaned against the fridge, glass of wine in hand, not drinking it. Grayson had his sleeves rolled to his elbows and a buzz in his voice. "Babe," he called from the living room, "you want a prenup? You can have one right now." I wiped my hands, walked over. "Sure," I said lightly. "Let's make it official." I didn't blink. He reached for a napkin cloth, deep rust color, and pulled out a pen from his jacket. "I, Grayson Hale, waive all claims to Margot Hale's personal or future assets in case of separation or divorce. Happy." He added a shaky signature. Dated it, held it out like a joke. Like a dare. I took it. Folded it slowly. "Thanks," I said. He laughed. Beth chuckled softly. Naomi didn't. She just looked at me, long and steady. That night, while the dishes soaked and the pie cooled, she found me in the laundry room. We didn't say much. I handed her the napkin. She didn't even ask. Just nodded. "Bring it by tomorrow. I'll notarize it at the office." I nodded too. Neither of us smiled. The next morning, while Grayson slept off the wine and praise, I slipped out with a Tupperware of leftover stuffing and the folded napkin in my purse. Naomi met me in her firm's lobby. Empty. Holiday hours. 10 minutes later, it was real. Not just a napkin anymore. We didn't hug goodbye. It didn't feel like that kind of moment. Back home, I slid the notarized document into a fireproof envelope, labeled it MISC. Tucked it under a folder marked Receipts 2020 in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the one Grayson never opened because it smelled like taxes. That night I scanned it. Uploaded it to a cloud folder Naomi helped me create years ago when she was still practicing family law. The folder name was boring by design. Insurance documentation, auto claims. Grayson never asked about the napkin. Never brought it up again. Maybe he thought I threw it away. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he never took me seriously. But I check that folder every month, just to be sure it's still there. Women are predictable, Nate said. She'll cry when she sees it. I was carrying the tray of drinks. Whiskey glasses rattled against each other. A slice of orange slid off a rim. And I froze. Because they didn't know I was behind the door. The hallway was dim, lit only by the flicker of fairy lights. Grayson's voice followed. She won't expect it. Not on Christmas. Nate chuckled, slurring a little. Clean exit, man. Genius. No drama. She'll crumble. Grayson replied, smooth as ever. They always do. My heart didn't pound. It didn't race. It just slowed. Like it wanted to listen longer. I adjusted my grip on the tray. Pushed the door open with my shoulder. Hey boys, I said. My smile steady. My eyes even steadier. Nate blinked at me, suddenly sheepish. Grayson didn't even flinch. He reached for his drink like nothing had been said. I served them both. Laughed at whatever dumb story came next. Complimented someone's velvet dress. And refilled a cheese plate like the perfect hostess. But something inside me wasn't playing anymore. That night, while Grayson snored beside me, I wrote Naomi an email. Subject line, I'm ready. Message, I'm done pretending. She replied in 10 minutes. Come by tomorrow. The next morning, I sat across from her at her office. Outside, December bit at the windows. Inside, Naomi pushed a folder toward me. This will hold, she said. You don't need to shout to win. Inside the folder was a formal addendum. Attached to the napkin agreement. Tighter. Legal. Clean. I signed it with the same hand that had once trembled. This time it didn't shake. I sat in Naomi's office the next morning, my hands still cold even after finishing the ginger tea she offered. She didn't speak right away. Just slid a folder across the table. The paper inside was crisp, the ink still fresh. This is the formal addendum, she said softly. It supports the napkin. I let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because of how far we'd come since that Thanksgiving joke. Remember when you said he wouldn't sign a thing sober? Naomi nodded. I looked down at the folder. Last night he told his friend I'd cry. When I saw it. Saw what his exit. His gift for Christmas morning. She didn't respond, just sat back, hands folded, letting it sink. I'm not going to cry, I said. I know, she replied. Then added almost as a whisper, you don't need to shout to win, Margot. For a moment I just stared at the folder. Not out of fear. Not even anger. But something else, something steadier. Like the silence after snow falls. Not empty. Not cold, just clear. When I stepped out of her office, the December wind hit my face. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush. I just walked to my car, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel the cold at all. He handed me the envelope like it was a joke we'd both laugh at later. White. Heavy. Creased with confidence. I hadn't even touched my wine yet. Around us the dining table shimmered with little gold trees and rosemary sprigs tucked into cloth napkins. Beth had chosen the playlist soft carols, nothing too sentimental. The roast duck had just been cleared and Lynette was still dabbing her lipstick with the corner of her napkin. Grayson stood with a glass in one hand and the envelope in the other. He smiled the way men do when they think they've solved everything. Then he said too cheerfully, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." I tilted my head, reaching for the envelope. The paper was warm. His fingers had gripped it tightly. I opened it. Read the words. Didn't blink. He'd filed the divorce. No conversation. No warning. No apology. It was all their dates, division of property, assumption of goodwill. He must have worked on it for months. He probably high-fived Nate the day it went to the courthouse. I looked up. He was still grinning. The room waited, quiet, half-interested, mostly drunk, but I could feel Beth's eyes on me. And Naomi's voice in my head, "You don't need revenge. You need evidence." So I smiled, a small one. Just enough to make Grayson relax, to make him believe for one last second that he'd won. Then I reached under the table. From under the table, I lifted the gold-wrapped box. No bow. Just neat corners and deliberate tape. The kind of wrapping that says, "I meant this." Grayson's brow creased. He chuckled. "You got me something." Nate leaned forward, curious. Lynette straightened in her chair. "I did," I said, voice even. I pushed the box across the table right where his plate had been. "You should open it now." He peeled the wrapping with too much flair, playing it up for the room. Tissue paper rustled. Then the edge of a blue legal folder peeked out. The smirk slid from his face. He lifted the contents, a notarized copy of the napkin he signed. The formal addendum Naomi helped prepare. A copy of the prenup clause he laughed at 2 years ago. Then, a final sheet. A sonogram photo. Dated exactly 2 weeks ago. Tiny limbs. A heartbeat line frozen mid-wave. Grayson stared. No sound came from his mouth. Even Nate looked like someone had yanked the whiskey out of his hand. I reached forward, gently tapped the photo. "Congratulations," I said softly. "You're going to be a footnote in the child's life you thought I'd never have." He tried to speak, but nothing came. His mouth opened then closed. "And just so you know," I added, folding my hands, "I had the folder ready before you handed me yours." Beth set down her wineglass. It clicked against the table. The only other sound was a single candle, crackling quietly beside the cranberry sauce. I stood up slowly. Dinner was lovely. "I'll clean in the morning." No one moved. Not even Lynette. The table didn't move, but everything else did. He looked at me like I'd rewritten the rules. But I hadn't. I'd just read them. Carefully. Quietly. Over and over while he performed for the room. I memorized the fine print. The table hadn't moved. The centerpiece was still there. Pine branches, silver ribbon, melted wax from the candle I'd lit before the roast went in. But the air felt like something had cracked. Grayson didn't sit back down. He was still standing beside his chair, holding the gold wrapping in one hand, the divorce envelope in the other. He blinked. Then again. Like he was waiting for anyone to undo what had just happened. Nate broke the silence first. "Holy." He didn't finish. Just dragged his hand down his face and poured more wine. Across from me, Lynette took off her pearls. Not because they were heavy, she wore them every holiday. But this time her fingers fumbled at the clasp. And for once she didn't say a word. Beth didn't look surprised. She just leaned closer, slid her fingers under the table, and found my hand. She squeezed once. Solid. Simple, like I wasn't alone in the room anymore. Grayson finally exhaled. "You planned this." I looked at him. Not up, not down. Just level. "No," I said. "You did. I just didn't stop you." He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then looked down at the sonogram still lying in the box like it didn't belong there. He picked it up, stared at the name printed across the top corner, mine, and the date. 2 weeks ago. For a man who lived by control, by schedules and performance reviews and quarterly reports, he suddenly looked like someone who didn't remember how he got here. Or maybe he did, and just hadn't expected me to follow the map. His phone buzzed on the sideboard. He didn't pick it up, but the preview lit up the screen. Subject line: prenup confirmed, Naomi Greer Esquire. I didn't look away. Didn't flinch. Not even when the next buzz came. FWD for your records, Grayson Sr. Grayson didn't move. He just stared at the emails lighting up his phone like a countdown he hadn't set. Like someone had swapped the script at intermission and now he didn't know his next line. For a second, I thought he might laugh. That smug dismissive chuckle he used when a waitress got his order wrong or when Beth mispronounced a wine label, but his mouth didn't move. His eyes did. Fast. Between the napkin, the printout, the sonogram, and me. I gave you everything, he finally muttered. As if I should apologize for not crumbling. I stood up. Not quickly, not with flair. Just enough to reach for the dessert plates. I didn't ask. I didn't wait. I simply began collecting them one by one. The ones still full, the ones picked at. The one Nate had dropped his fork into. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. Beth looked down then up at me again. Her voice was soft but it landed like a weight on the linen. Next year, she said, we do Christmas at my place. Lynette blinked but didn't protest. Her hands were folded now, her pearls coiled next to her water glass like a snake too tired to hiss. Grayson sank slowly into his chair. The same one he toasted from. The same one he stood beside when he gave me the envelope. Now, he looked smaller in it. Like a man who'd tried to pull a trick and ended up pulling the curtain off himself. I stacked the plates. Took the napkin back. Folded it neatly. No one noticed where I slipped it. When I turned toward the kitchen, the house felt colder. But it wasn't from the draft, it was from the absence of performance. Of power, of pretense. There was no gavel. No raised voice. No camera. Just a room. A flickering fire. And the sound of a man, finally realizing he lost. And I didn't even have to raise my voice. Everything without him. I changed the locks the next morning. Beth handed me the new keys still warm from her pocket. I held them tight in my palm like they were proof. Not of protection, but of permission. I didn't owe anyone access anymore. Not even memory. The air smelled like cinnamon again. Not from a candle this time, but from the actual sticks I simmered in a pot with orange peel. The same way Mom used to do when I was little. A small tradition. A small reclaiming. Beth was in the garden that morning humming and pulling weeds with sleeves rolled up. The lavender had bloomed faster than I expected, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. I watched her from the window with my hands around a cup of tea. It was quiet. No one performing. No one watching. The house somehow felt like it had exhaled. The rugs were still the same. The walls hadn't changed. But the air didn't carry tension anymore. Just light. Filtered in through clean windows and open curtains. I didn't cry when I dropped the wedding album off at the donation center. It was heavier than it looked. The woman behind the counter asked, "You sure?" I nodded. Didn't need to explain. It wasn't grief I felt, it was space. Space I hadn't had in years. Space between each breath, between who I had to be and who I actually was. When I got home, the journal was waiting on the kitchen counter. Same one I'd written in months ago, just one sentence at the time. Now I flipped to the next page and wrote the title out in soft pen, "Plans that are only mine." No edits. No negotiations. Just me. And the future that was no longer tied to someone else's idea of what I should be. The nursery came together like bread rising in a quiet oven. Slow, gentle, unhurried. No rushing to assemble a perfect crib. No Pinterest folders or color charts pinned to the fridge. Just one small act a day. One drawer lined. One stuffed rabbit placed beside the window. Beth painted the walls soft green. The kind of green that makes you breathe slower without realizing. She said it reminded her of the field behind our grandmother's house. I nodded, remembering the way we used to chase fireflies in the dark before life taught us to second-guess everything. She planted lavender outside the window. "Not for the baby," she said, "for me. Lavender doesn't need much," she added, patting the soil, "just space and light." Naomi stopped by the next afternoon. No files, no firm handshake. Just a paper bag with bagels and a folded sheet tucked under her arm. We sat at the kitchen table, two women no longer bracing for battle. She pulled out the paper. A list of baby names scribbled in two different pens. I crossed out anything with extra letters just to be cute, she said. You deserve peace, not confusion. We read through them one by one. Some made us laugh, some made us pause. And then somewhere between Lena and Maris, Naomi looked at me and said, "You don't flinch anymore." I didn't answer right away. Just let the quiet settle around us. The only sound was the breeze through the curtains and Beth's soft humming from the yard. There was a time not long ago when even that would have felt too loud. That evening I baked for the first time in months. Not because someone expected dessert. Not because it made me feel useful, but because I wanted the scent of cinnamon and peach in the air again. I walked barefoot in the hallway, no voice trailing me. No phone buzzing. Just my own rhythm against the floorboards, the sound of a home learning how to breathe differently. That morning, I sliced peaches with a steady hand. Sunlight spilled across the counter like honey. No rush. No second guessing. The knife moved in quiet arcs. I hummed something without realizing. Maybe a hymn, maybe nothing at all. I had just placed the slices in the dish when it happened to flutter. Soft. Like a page turning inside me. I froze. Then I felt it again. Not gas, not nerves. A nudge. Real. Alive. I pressed both hands to my belly. The bowl of peaches waited beside me. But the world had shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough. I didn't cry. I smiled. Not the kind people expect in photos. The kind that comes from somewhere old and quiet, like a well finally filling after years of drought. Beth walked in with a bundle of herbs. She took one look at my face and paused. I nodded. Her eyes widened. Then softened. She didn't speak. Just placed the herbs down and came closer. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us staring at nothing in particular, just breathing in something new. Later I wrote it down, not in my journal. On a slip of paper I tucked behind a drawer in the nursery. He moved today, and I didn't think about him, only us. It was the kind of sentence I knew I'd find years later and still remember the scent in the room. The light. The feeling of no one watching. That night Naomi texted thinking of you. Some stories don't end, they change shape. I stared at the message for a long time. Then typed back, I think I'm starting mine. A week later, a bouquet arrived. No note. No return address. Just white tulips, fresh, crisp, and silent. The card inside simply read, "About time." Beth raised an eyebrow when she saw it. I shrugged. I don't need to know who sent them, I said. They're not for them anyway. She nodded, then picked up a muffin tin like we'd just been talking about groceries. The court documents came in a plain brown envelope. I signed. Initialed. Dropped it off at the post office without hesitation. The house felt cleaner the next morning. Not physically, though Beth had gone on one of her Saturday scrubbing sprees, but something had cleared, the echoes were gone. I opened the drawer in the nursery again. The note was still there. I didn't reread it. Just smiled and closed it gently. I turned the key in a lock that no longer scared me. Watched as the old keys dropped into a jar marked past things. Somewhere beside a candle stub and the last spoon from our old flatware set. In the evenings now I walk barefoot out to the porch. The lavender is taller. The steps creak, but in a friendly way. I sit with a glass of iced tea and let the wind move through the curtains. Sometimes I hum. Sometimes I don't. No one asks me to explain anymore. No one interrupts the silence with opinions or advice. And that's the real gift. The kind you don't unwrap. The kind you grow into. I once thought life after him would feel like a void. But it didn't. It felt like a room I'd never explored before, already mine, just waiting for me to open the door. I press my hand against my belly again. A quiet flutter answers. A rhythm that belongs only to us. I whisper. He said I'd fall apart without him. But he was wrong. And then I just sit there barefoot on the porch, the sun soft, the breeze warm, and the world finally quiet. When I changed the locks and opened the curtains, the house no longer scared me. It was just a porch, a nursery, a few rows of lavender, and a slower rhythm quiet enough to hear myself again. Some wounds don't need revenge. They just need time, clarity, and a simple sentence you whisper to yourself, "I've spent enough time surviving for others. Now I get to live for me." If you've ever stayed in something too long because it felt safer than starting over, remember this: love doesn't ask you to disappear. Real love lets you be seen. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.